Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be with you, and I want to thank everyone in this room, the organizers of this incredible conference, for putting food at the center of the climate crisis. So why food? Well, as we just heard, food represents a critical aspect of the climate solution. So we could go 100% renewable, take all the gas-powered cars off the road tomorrow, 100% renewable energy. But if we don't fix the food system, which represents from both production and food processing up to 30% of annual emissions, we are never going to solve the climate crisis. In addition to the biodiversity crisis and the water crisis, we know that food is absolutely essential to the solution. And here in Asia, it's incredibly important, given that the largest agricultural workforce on planet Earth is in Asia Pacific. So an estimated 830 million people rely on direct food production or food processing for their livelihoods. So this is ground zero, and that is why we're here today with this incredible panel to talk about the role of food and food solutions for climate change. So I want to start. And we don't have a lot of time, so we're going to jump right into it. And I'm not going to do a long introduction of the panelists. They're all incredible. We spent some time just now in the green room. You can see their titles up above here on the screen. But let's get into it. So, Yvonne, I'm going to start with you. My question for you. You are at the International Rice Research Institute. You are the Director General. And from your perspective, working with farmers, where do you see the food system breaking down most often beyond the farm gate? Is it in water reliability, energy costs or access or market incentives? And what does a better aligned system look like?
Thank you so much for a great question, a question that's relevant to all of us given the amount of rice that we eat and the fact that it feeds 4 billion people today. Food security in the region is not really about production alone. It's time that we started to put these pieces of the intelligence together. We're living in a very volatile environment. Market and systems intelligence are becoming essential tools for that food security, and particularly in Asia, to enable faster responses to shocks and indeed our geopolitical situation, we need more resilient supply chains, better informed decision-making across both production and trade and food access. So I think that the answer to our problem is to start to work together in a really integrated way. We need farm-level productivity information, which includes the amount of water, the application of inputs, the yield, the tools that farmers have. We need to dovetail that with climate risks. We need to be able to see what these issues are at a landscape level and plan for them, look at scenarios and make those choices. We need to ensure supply chains are aware of both the product production and indeed the risks in the system. And we need to ensure that trade flows are enabled. We need to get a little bit away from things like export bans that cause major disruptions in price, major shocks for farmers, and essentially undermine the investment farmers make in their farming system. And we also need to have fair market pricing. We've got a lot of evidence across the region where only 8% of global rice, for example, is traded. And so if we have an undersupply in one year or an oversupply, we see really large market shocks. So I think that we need to make investments in bringing this information together so we make better decisions. Let me just say one thing. An EU study estimates that $10.2 billion is lost annually in not being able to integrate data and therefore use it. The rice sector does not lack data assets. These data assets are not integrated. And so we need to be able to see what is happening at the farm level, at the farm gate level, and ensure the supply chain is integrated all the way to a national production system and then a regional and a global. So I think we need just better intelligence, and instead of doing a lot of pilots of work in these areas, we need to create a backbone that is integrated.
Absolutely. Thank you. Clearly, having better data integration is essential to scale. So thank you for that challenge. Let me turn now to Wuchang. So Wuchang, if we connect the dots between electrification and food systems in a way that changes outcomes on the ground, what would you say to this group are the 1 to 2 energy interventions you think matter most?
Thank you very much. I just arrived in Singapore this morning from Africa, and I love coming to Singapore. You know why? It's the food. And the first thing I did is I told my team, said, I'm busy this morning. And guess where I went? Hawker Center, right? Yeah, so this is wonderful to be here, and also thank the PAN and all the organizers for making it happen. You know, you wonder, I'm from the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, so we're about energy. So what's energy got to do with food? A lot to do with it. You know, I came from South Korea originally, and you know, Korea, as you know, is quite advanced with K-pop and Samsung and even, you know, cosmetics and everything. But it wasn't always like that. We were energy poor just 1 generation ago, but the society invested in energy to help propel the economic development in all sectors, including food security, which is probably the most important thing. Because, you know, I'm one of those people who live to eat, not eat to live, right? So you gotta take care of that. And what happens is that a lot of times, whether if you're coming from the agriculture, fisheries sector, and then if you come from energy, there's not enough communication between the two. And agriculture sector, they they go to a place to see what they can do in terms of increasing productivity, other than doing research work. That's great for the, you know, from the IRRI perspective. But a lot of times they assume that there's electricity on the ground. But the problem is, if there's no electricity, what do? They go elsewhere. So this is, whether it's a fisheries or agriculture and health and so on and so forth, instead of trying to figure out how you can actually solve the energy on the ground, you go somewhere else. And vice versa, the energy engineers go to places and they provide electricity, and then that's the end of their job. So the two parties have to talk to each other so that agriculture productivity goes up. Examples in India under the National Solarization Program, where electrification, the solarization of the rural households in the farm area is tripling the income of the farmers because they're being so much more productive. And when I visited last time, people's behavior, they said people's behavior has changed to see the farmers looking at what energy can do. So you gotta plant the seed. In this region, we have something very similar to soil to sea. Ours is sun to sea. It's to link solarization with the fisheries industry in the remote islands in Indonesia, so that we can provide the cooler that's powered by solar energy. But in that one, we're actually going one step further. Not just sun to sea, but sun to fish, but also nature, so that we can work with partners. We don't claim to do everything in the whole spectrum of activities, but we work with partners like the Conservation International, and perhaps the TNC can work with us to help restore the coastal area so that there's enough fish yield. And then, as you know, when you restore mangroves, you all of a sudden blue carbon becomes possible, right? Now, if you can tap that and put it back into the community to diversify their the products to beyond just the fish, let's say to the seaweed, then all of a sudden the whole Japanese and Korean market opens up with a cooler. So this kind of collaboration is absolutely essential, and it's not that complicated. You just need to have people talking in the same room, and don't just stop where you feel comfortable. Talk to somebody who you have nothing in common on the surface, then you'll figure out a great systems-changing collaboration across the board.
I love that, Wuchang. Yeah, it's so important. We found in working with shrimp farmers in places like Indonesia and Thailand that the largest source of emissions was actually the diesel to do the filtration. And so changing to solar is very simple. So you're absolutely right. Getting those two communities to talk to each other is essential. So thank you. So Liz, I've got a question for you, and I know you won't be surprised at the topic, which is philanthropy. So for this audience is really looking to be catalytic with its capital. And where do you see philanthropy where it can most effectively reduce early stage risk and fund coordination so that integrated soil to sea solutions can move from fragmented pilots to investable, scalable models?
This is a great question. I think we've been trying to work at this for 113 years at the Rockefeller Foundation. And thank you, PAA, for having me, and thank you, Temasek, for inviting me to join you today. One of my favorite things, I just was in Nairobi too, but one of my favorite things I heard from a colleague of ours, or one of our partners actually there, and let me just not get this right, philanthropy has more pilots than the Air Force. That's just ridiculous. So I think from our perspective, it's really stuck with me. We've got to continue to make sure that we have the evidence, the momentum, but what we really, really want to do is fix some of the things that are broken. So fix the demand signals when they're not clear. We want to make sure that we fix the supply chains, like you talked about, Wuchang, when they're not aligned. We want to make sure that financing actually links to opportunity and is not just out there that is inaccessible. And we also need to make sure that the institutions that are intended to carry this work forward are actually capacitated and able to do that. And so in our journey, I think you hear a lot about some of these ideas on de-risking demand and not just supply. And one thing, Jen, that I wanted to make sure that we talked about here was, what are some of those ideas? One thing that we've stumbled upon is procurement as a really important opportunity, and I want to share a little bit more about what we're doing, but I wanted to park that one thing with you. Number two is my colleague Dipali, who leads our Asia Regional Office. We had a whole bunch of our grantees together this morning. It's that coordination and the unsexy pieces of infrastructure that philanthropy needs to support to make sure that we're actually building the architecture that delivers on the change that we're trying to drive. It may not always sound important, but actually that is what our grantees, that is what helps drive that change that we're looking for. And then perhaps last, which was I mentioned earlier, making sure that we also support those institutions. Do it on a locally led basis, because that is really important, but also make sure that those local actors have the chance and the resources, the capacity they need to deliver. And I wanted to give you an example of something that we've doing. I've been in Asia for the past week with my colleagues and our partners looking at some of our regenerative school meals work. So I'm just going to do a quick show of hands. How many people have had a school meal in their entire life? Has to be more than that. Okay. Well, I'm guessing maybe some people are shy. But here's the thing. So school meals are the world's biggest safety net. 466 million children get those meals every single day. And we were talking about it earlier because rice represents about 70% of those school meals plates. And I say that because I think what you kind of hear through this is, that's an interesting demand driver. That's a potential market. And so one of the things that the foundation did last year was to make a $100 million big bet on this idea of regenerative school meals. And it's the opportunity to link some of the things that we've talked about, farm systems, more sustainable food systems, and children who actually need these meals, because only 50% of the kids who need these meals actually get those meals. How do we look at what those government signals are? How do we look at procurement? How do we think about finance? And not just work at the supply side, but actually work at the intersection of supply and demand to help drive and build more investable markets. And so as I think about our work, as we try as a foundation to help drive the systems change, achieve some of the things that this panel has talked about, we're really thinking about how best to use our capital most catalytically to help build those sustainable markets. Because one of the things that is very clear to me is we all talk about systems change. The difference between a pilot and systems change is that someone other than philanthropy decided to fund it. And that's where we need to go in order to build the food systems, the supply systems, the demand systems, and the future for the people of this region and the planet that we all seek to achieve.
Fantastic. And I love the focus on school meals, not only for the reasons that you say and having government be a driver of demand, but also clearly we know the links between regenerative agriculture and health. And so providing those kids with healthy meals and that's also healthy for the planet is wonderful. So thank you so much for that. So Anuj, turning to you, you are at Temasek, Managing Director and Head of Agri-Food. So this is clearly an important topic to you. And from your perspective as an investor, what are the biggest risks that keep capital from flowing into climate-smart, resilient food systems?
Thank you, Jennifer. So let's start with the first premise that food and agriculture is a huge investment opportunity for most investors globally, whether it is private equity, whether it's firms like us. It's a 10 trillion plus economy and needs a lot of solutions. Now, in my opinion, Jennifer, capital is not the problem. Capital per se is not the problem. The problem is how to create bankable, predictable systems that then can be scaled up. And that's where, is the crux of the problem, which several of my colleagues here highlighted. Food is much more of an operating system. It is such a combination between water, energy, trade systems, health, which you just mentioned, livelihoods, and it takes everybody, every particular stakeholder, including governments, to be part of it. The challenge with climate resilient food systems has been that many times they are at odds with incumbent food systems. And these incumbent systems are widely supported by governments around the world. Hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidy goes into the systems which have been around for the last 150 plus years. And therefore, a lot of these nascent ideas do not get the full support from the stakeholders, because something like this requires that scale to be able to get to it. And that's where, I think has been mentioned, it needs to be a combination of philanthropies, private capital, entrepreneurs who can actually take ideas to the next level, that can bring alternate ideas to the table. I mean, there are enough things where technology alone is not the solution. Many times people feel that it's technology, but there are many technologies which have been proven time and again that they work, but we are not able to de-risk those technologies for greater adoption. I think at Temasek, we have been able to look beyond that and be able to invest across this system. And in many cases, we've had to create companies which can actually solve these problems at scale. So we need more alternate thinking. We need governments to play the role. We obviously need the philanthropies to play a role. And capital will come its own way to do it.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Anuj. But I'm going to follow up with a question for all my panelists, since you've been so good about keeping your answers fairly short. And that is something you've all touched on, but let's go a little bit deeper, and that is scale. So, Anuj, you seem to just have said that subsidies are a big problem. Is there a world in which we evolve and change agricultural subsidies to focus more on regenerative ag?
I hope so, certainly. But today, I believe most governments are not playing this game. I mean, just talking about my home country, India, they've taken a climate pledge of being carbon neutral in 2070, 10 years later than China and 20 years later than the developed world. But it omits methane, which is one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases. And so I don't think there is enough momentum right now to do that. Yes, of course, one would hope that as the climate crisis builds up, governments will follow and take more prominent pledges.
So Liz, you mentioned one demand signal which is critical for scale, which is of course procurement and school lunch meals. What are some other sectors that you're seeing in the food space where you're seeing the ability to get to scale if only a policy change or more catalytic philanthropy would be engaged?
I'd love to build on the procurement example and then maybe give another one as well. So just if we can fly over to the country of Brazil for a second, I think this goes back to how procurement can really change outcomes. And one thing that Brazil has specifically on school meals, for example, right now, is they have a policy in place to do somewhere between 40 and 50% local sourcing, local regenerative. And for those farmers who are able to participate in that procurement, we've actually seen their household income double. And so it's that, what someone said this morning, polytunity, that both delivers the health outcomes, the food outcomes, the school meals outcomes, that we are trying to aim our capital at. I guess I would say that is where philanthropy, and that's how we want to see the world move forward, especially at a time, and we haven't talked about all of the aid cuts that are happening, and philanthropy and investments really actually asking to do more. I think another thing that we've been looking at in partnership with others and have moved some capital behind is this idea of the regenerative transition. We know that many farmers are less comfortable with transitioning from their conventional approaches to growing crops because their livelihoods depend on it. And so to the extent that philanthropy can come in, and we've done this in a few places to basically increase the flexibility of loan, increase the tenure of loan, aggregate loans, especially since so many of the world are smallholder farmers and need access to credit and financial literacy. If philanthropy can actually use its capital to do that connectivity, to create those pathways for people to participate and grow their businesses, we can actually achieve a lot more of those aims that we've been talking about today.
Fantastic. So Wu Chang, talk to us about scale in your space.
Yeah, so scale meaning you need a lot of money to be invested, right? So as Anuj says, for the money to flow in a big scale, you cannot rely on grant. You got to make bankable investments possible. So Liz talked about pilots, many pilots. I think what's been happening a lot is that pilots have been happening in a silo again, without proper sort of stacking with potential financing. And if you look at, I mentioned about, there are like 700 million people who do not have electricity around the world. It's been stuck with a number for the last 10 years. If you unpack that number, vast majority of those people are in the agriculture sector and fisheries and the remote, hard to reach. Because again, people are looking at it, let's say from the Asian Development Bank, they're looking at it from the silo perspective. And if you just look at a farmer who are actually working, maybe 20% of the time because electricity is shorted, then the project is not bankable. But we've seen in the cases in India and in Malawi, I was just there. These people have theoretically free electricity, the farmers, but they only get electricity from 2 to 5 in the morning, which is completely useless because they can't do the agro-processing and things get delayed. In the case in Malawi, again, they have electricity, but the load shedding and they cut electricity off for days, so you don't know what's actually happening. But with the solar solution, you're actually increasing the productivity of the farmers, increasing their income. So the bankability goes up if you can capture that in a proper way. So this is where the philanthropic money comes in, which is most risk tolerant among all the players. The MDBs, they're all AAA organizations, which means they have to do AAA projects. So that's why if there's a 700 million people, the high risk, they can't go there. So we have to focus on putting together proposals that puts the whole thing integrated so that the project becomes much more financially viable, and then pilot tested and show the partners who has a lot of money to bring in a scale. So we got to co-create this kind of investments together up front. All of us here, plus the ADB and the World Bank, to see where we're going. Then once we pilot and make it bankable, then you can get billions into the investment space, even crowding in private sector as well. Because I know both the World Bank and ADB are quite big in agribusiness work and also in the C aspect of it.
Great. Yeah, but that catalytic philanthropy that can be risk on is essential to have change. That's great. So Yvonne, I'm curious, you mentioned data integration and data processing is one of your major challenges. So no conference would be complete without the mention of AI. I'm curious if you're seeing the use of AI in this data management problem and you see potentials for it to scale.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I really want to congratulate my panelists here for talking about the together model. When we think about scale, it's not just about food. It's about health, it's about environment, it's about economy. We've got to bring those actors into the conversation. When we talk about research and development, which is more in the area of my institution, it's not simply about innovation. It is about piloting, it is about demonstrating, it is about transitioning to scale, and indeed operating in an ecosystem with all of the other players, from banks to institutions that are helping farmers, to input providers, to logistics and marketing, to, perhaps the multilateral banks, etc., sovereign, capital, climate finance in an integrated way. Now, when we look at things across sectors or we look at things across an ecosystem, we really need to understand how to interpret the data coming from different areas. I think that there is a real opportunity for AI to play a role in being able to interpret that data simultaneously. The challenge is that we have disparate data and we don't have models that are trained on this disparate data. So how do we actually play out certain scenarios? Let's take a government trying to make a choice about where to invest a subsidy program. If we have the elements of the data that can give us some scenarios and look at the pros and cons of those scenarios from a government's perspective, we're in a much better position to actually choose a solution and understand what those trade-offs are. Let me give you an example of AI at the upstream end of research and development, just to give you a sense of the scale. IRRI happens to have the biggest rice gene bank in the world. And by looking at there are about 132,865 accessions. We've sequenced about 13,000 of them. And we've used AI to train, and we've used the data to train models that make it easier to find a specific trait. The one that I'm going to use is a submergence trait designed for Bangladesh. And using AI has made that process 16 times cheaper and 10 times faster. So these technologies can revolutionize the speed and the accuracy by which we can actually deliver results. Now, those products are in the field in 3 years, whereas traditionally it would have taken us somewhere between 12 and 15. There is an example of how things like AI can revolutionize. But I also believe it can do it at a level of scale. And if we can drive these advances at a regional level, the opportunities for food security, stability of that food system, and the outputs that relate to health and well-being, economy, environment, can be modeled and can be delivered.
Fantastic. Does anyone else, are you seeing some AI uses in the ag space that you wanted to share with the group?
I love what you said, because that's exactly what we've been seeing as well. One of the partners that we work with is an organization called Digital Green. And the opportunity there, I think many of you know, ag farm extension costs are very, very expensive and very hard to reach. But in this app, a farmer can take a picture of a plant and ask a question to AI to understand what are the input costs, what are the inputs that I need to do, what's wrong with my plant, or even what plant is this? And it helps them be able to actually learn and figure out how to grow their crops better, how to improve their yields, how to make sure that they're actually building a more sustainable landscape, I would say, for future growth. So I think that's one overlay. It's not necessarily funding AI, but funding the translation, building the trust with communities and farmers in particular to make sure that they are positioned to be able to thrive.
Fantastic. Noosh, do you have something you want to share?
Yeah, I think, look, AI is a platform technology, but the example that I would share is one of our companies is using AI to screen more novel plant-based ingredients which have a health angle to it. As you know, the global agriculture system is built on 12 crops, which provide 95% of the calories. But if we widen that by knowing what else is out there, that has many benefits, including biodiversity, but also solve certain problems around there. So I think AI is going to become a technology which every single company uses, definitely for discovery, but also for implementation over time.
Fantastic. Well, we're ready to close. I just want to thank this incredible panel for sharing. Clearly, we are all about scale. Technology is one, systems change around subsidies and policy, and then, of course, seeing those demand signals and the integration of energy and food. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to my panelists, and thank you to PAS for this great subject.